The air inside Aurelia was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, a substance thick with the scent of old money, truffles, and a faint floral perfume that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It tasted of power. Light from colossal crystal chandeliers, suspended like frozen constellations, did not illuminate the room so much as it dripped onto the tables, catching the gleam of polished silver and the deep red of wine that cost more per glass than a month's rent. The silence here was a commodity, a heavy, expensive blanket punctuated only by the delicate clinking of cutlery against porcelain and the hushed murmur of conversations that could shift global markets. Each table was an island, spaced so far apart that secrets worth billions could be exchanged with impunity. To work here was to learn the art of invisibility, to glide through this golden sanctuary like a ghost, your purpose solely to facilitate the comfort of the gods who dined within its hallowed halls, never to be seen, never to be heard, only to be felt as a seamless extension of their will. Clara Evans had perfected this art of erasure. Her movements were a study in fluid efficiency, a ballet of silent service choreographed to the rhythm of unspoken needs. A water glass refilled before it was half empty, a fallen napkin replaced before its owner had even noticed its absence. To the titans of industry and finance who frequented Aurelia, she was nothing more than a pair of hands, a part of the impeccable decor. But beneath the starched white uniform and the professionally neutral expression was a universe of knowledge they could never comprehend. Her mind was a fortress, a library of Alexandria dedicated to the intricate failings of the human body. Images of synaptic gaps, diagrams of the brachial plexus, and pages from obscure neurology journals were filed away with perfect eidetic recall. She could see the subtle tells of physiological distress in the way a man held his fork, the slight pallor beneath a woman's expensive makeup, the almost imperceptible tremor in a hand reaching for a wine glass. She was a ghost in their world, but a ghost who saw everything. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. This hyper-observance was not a party trick. It was a weapon forged in pain and honed by desperation. Every night, after leaving the gilded cage of Aurelia, she returned to a small, quiet apartment that smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. There, her true life resided, in the gentle, constant care of her father. He was a man who had once been a bastion of strength, a factory foreman whose hands could fix any engine, now reduced to a frail figure in a specialized bed. His decline was the central, defining tragedy of her life, a slow-motion collapse caused by a mysterious neurodegenerative disease. She remembered the day the diagnosis finally came, a rare cluster in her hometown, a place poisoned by the silent, steady leaching of toxic chemicals into the water table. The corporation responsible had settled, a pittance that admitted no guilt, a legal maneuver that bought their silence and sealed their fate. It was this injustice that had derailed her own destiny, pulling her from the fast track of the MD-PhD program at Johns Hopkins, where she had been a neurology prodigy, and placing her here, in this uniform, her brilliant mind focused on a single, unwavering purpose: to keep her father comfortable, to afford his dignity, and to one day find the justice that money had stolen from them. The atmosphere in Aurelia shifted, a subtle drop in pressure that signaled the arrival of a significant power. Julian Thorne did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He moved with an aura of absolute certainty, the kind that comes from a life lived without consequence. The Maitre D', a man who regularly greeted senators and royalty with stoic grace, seemed to shrink in his presence, his posture becoming almost obsequious. Thorne was followed by a younger, visibly nervous executive, a lamb being led to a very expensive slaughter. Thorne's suit was a whisper of dark, tailored wool that cost more than Clara's car, his watch a sliver of platinum and sapphire. He didn't look at the staff, he looked through them, his eyes sweeping the room not with appreciation for its beauty, but with the cold assessment of an emperor surveying his domain. He carried with him a palpable disdain, a chilling indifference to the humanity that served him. To him, they were not people, they were functions, tools, and he was a man who discarded tools that did not perform to his exacting standards. Seated at the best table in the house, the one overlooking the city's glittering skyline, the dynamic of power was starkly clear. Thorne barely spoke, communicating his displeasure with a slight narrowing of his eyes, a dismissive flick of his wrist. The junior executive babbled, his words a desperate stream of apologies and corporate jargon, trying to explain away a failed acquisition. Thorne listened with a predator's stillness, his boredom a more terrifying weapon than any raised voice. He picked up a silver fork, not to eat, but to examine it, turning it over in his fingers as if searching for a flaw in its very existence before placing it down with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. Clara watched from a distance, her internal diagnostic engine humming quietly. She noted the tension in Thorne's jaw, the slight flush on his neck, the way his focus was absolute and yet entirely self-contained. He was a black hole of narcissism, pulling all light and energy into himself, leaving nothing for those in his orbit but fear and shadow. He was the architect of his own universe, and tonight he was deeply, profoundly displeased with its workings. The inciting incident, when it came, was almost laughably small, a testament to the monumental scale of the man's ego. Clara approached the table to refill their water glasses, her movements as practiced and silent as a breath. As she tilted the heavy crystal pitcher towards Thorne's glass, her cuff brushed against a bread plate, an infinitesimal nudge that caused a single, perfect drop of water to escape and land on the pristine white linen of the tablecloth. It was a flaw in the perfect tapestry, a tiny stain on his immaculate world. The junior executive flinched as if a gunshot had rung out. The air grew thick and cold. Clara's training kicked in immediately. She reached for a fresh napkin to correct the microscopic error, her expression unchanged, her apology already forming on her lips. But it was too late. The moment had been breached. The god's sanctum had been violated by the clumsiness of a mortal. Julian Thorne's fury was not explosive. It was a cold, precise weapon. He didn't shout, he moved. His hand shot out impossibly fast and clamped around Clara's forearm. The grip was like steel, a brutal, shocking violation in the hushed elegance of the restaurant. The pressure was immense, his fingers digging into her flesh with the intent to cause pain, to assert dominance. His voice was a low, menacing snarl, a sound that vibrated with the absolute conviction of his own power. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he hissed, his face a mask of contempt, his eyes boring into hers. "I could end your entire insignificant life with one phone call. I could have you erased. You are nothing." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. All around them, the quiet hum of the restaurant had ceased. Every eye was on them. He was making an example of her, using her to exorcise the rage from his failed business deal, reminding everyone in the room, and especially himself, of his place at the top of the food chain. But the woman he was trying to intimidate was gone. In the instant his skin touched hers, a switch flipped deep within Clara's mind. The waitress, the servant, the ghost of Aurelia, evaporated. In her place stood the neurologist, the prodigy from Johns Hopkins. The fear and humiliation that should have flooded her system were instantly supplanted by a wave of cold, crystalline focus. The noise of the restaurant, the gasp from the nearby table, Thorne's venomous words, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. Her entire consciousness narrowed to a single point of data, the hand that was gripping her arm. Her mind, her true self, took control. The insult didn't matter. The threat was just noise. An image of her father's hand, trembling and weak, flashed in her memory, not with sadness, but as a clinical baseline. She wasn't a victim in this moment. She was a diagnostician, and a patient had just presented himself in the most unprofessional manner imaginable. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She simply looked down, her gaze analytical and devoid of all emotion, at the hand that was crushing her arm. Her mind was racing, cross-referencing, synthesizing. She ignored his words and focused on the evidence. There, a faint but persistent tremor in his thumb, a subtle, rhythmic twitching that was not born of anger but of pathology. And more, a slight, almost imperceptible hollowing of the muscle at the base of his thumb, the thenar eminence. It was a specific, damning pattern of muscle wasting. Her eidetic memory surged, pulling up anatomical charts, case studies, articles she had read years ago but remembered as if she had reviewed them this morning. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, satisfying certainty of a mathematical proof. He thought he was holding her, displaying his power. He had no idea that in his rage, he had handed her the key to his own body's deepest, most terrifying secret. He had revealed his own mortality, and she was the only person in the world who could read the language in which it was written. Her voice, when it finally emerged from the stunned silence, was not the voice of a waitress. It was a sound stripped of all deference, of all emotion, a clean, sterile instrument of pure observation. It was the voice of a clinician delivering a finding, devoid of warmth or malice, carrying only the immense, unshakable weight of fact. She did not raise her gaze from his hand, her focus absolute, as if she were examining a specimen under a microscope. The words came out, calm and measured, each one a perfectly placed scalpel slicing through the thick layers of his arrogance. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the ambient sounds of clinking silver and hushed conversations having evaporated into a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. The junior executive at the table looked as if he might faint, his face a pale mask of terror, caught in the crossfire of a battle he could not possibly comprehend. Clara's world had compressed to the space between her eyes and his trembling flesh, the universe of data presented by his own body. He thought he was the one in control, the one making a statement, but he had unknowingly walked into her laboratory, and the examination had already begun. She began to speak, her tone so dispassionate, it was more chilling than any shout could ever be. "Your hand," she stated, not as a question, but as a clinical declaration. The fasciculations in the first dorsal interosseous muscle, combined with the visible atrophy of the thenar eminence, they're indicative of a lower motor neuron disease. The medical terminology fell into the opulent air of Aurelia, like stones into a silent pool, alien and disruptive. Julian Thorne's grip on her arm didn't just loosen, it spasmed, a reflexive jolt, as if he'd been struck by an electric current. His mind, so accustomed to processing threats in terms of market shares and hostile takeovers, struggled to categorize this. It was an attack, but one that came from an impossible direction, using a language he did not understand but whose meaning he felt in the deepest, most primal part of his being. He was being dissected, analyzed by the woman he had just dismissed as nothing, and the cold precision of her words bypassed all his defenses, striking directly at the secret terror he had been nursing for months, a fear he had buried under mountains of money and armies of the world's most expensive, and so far useless, doctors. Clara continued, her gaze finally lifting from his hand to meet his eyes. There was no pity in her expression, no triumph, only the detached focus of a researcher presenting an undeniable conclusion. "It's not amyotrophic lateral sclerosis," she said, preempting the most common and terrifying diagnosis that had likely been whispered in hushed tones in sterile examination rooms. "Your doctors probably suspect it, but the progression doesn't fit the typical pattern. The presentation is too slow, and it's asymmetrical." She saw the flicker in his eyes, a spark of horrified recognition that confirmed her hypothesis. He was a man who had never been truly seen by anyone, only for his power and his wealth, and now this waitress was looking straight through his flesh and bone, reading the corrupted text of his genetic code. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate grinding into a new, terrifying alignment. He was no longer the emperor in his throne room. He was a patient, naked and vulnerable on an examination table, his body betraying him in front of the entire world. Then came the final, devastating stroke, the culmination of her diagnostic genius. "It's Kennedy's disease," she announced, the name of the rare condition landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. spinal and bulbar muscular atrophy. It's an X-linked recessive disorder. They're missing the diagnosis because they aren't looking for the associated endocrine symptoms, are they? The mild gynecomastia you hide with expert tailoring, the testicular atrophy, the reduced fertility. They see the neurological symptoms, but they're not connecting them to the androgen insensitivity that defines the condition. She had not just diagnosed him, she had narrated the entire secret history of his body's betrayal, exposing the hidden symptoms he thought were his alone, the subtle shames he concealed beneath his veneer of masculine power. She had articulated the very reason his own elite medical team, with their million-dollar imaging machines and batteries of tests, had failed. They were looking at the branches, but she had seen the root, the fundamental hidden flaw in his very biology. He had grabbed her to show her he was a god, and in response, she had shown him with terrifying accuracy that he was merely a man, and a fragile, dying one at that. Julian Thorne froze. The word does not do justice to the reality of the moment. It was a cessation of all life, all movement, all thought. The fury in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a vast, empty landscape of pure, unveiled terror. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor that made his expensive tan look like a cheap theatrical effect. He snatched his hand back from her arm as if her skin were white-hot iron, cradling it against his chest, not in a posture of aggression, but of protection, of a wounded animal trying to hide its fatal injury. The silence that followed was profound, a physical presence in the room. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was a statue, their eyes locked on the tableau at the center of the room. The billionaire titan, the master of the universe, had been completely and utterly dismantled by a waitress. He had tried to crush her with the weight of his identity, and she had responded by erasing it, replacing it with a definition he could not escape, a collection of symptoms, a case study, a rare disease. The terror, however, was a fleeting thing, a momentary glimpse into the abyss. It was too pure, too honest for a man like Julian Thorne to sustain. His entire life had been an exercise in converting any vulnerability into rage, and this moment would be no different. The primal fear curdled, boiling back into a familiar, empowering fury. It was a desperate defense mechanism, the lashing out of a cornered predator. Humiliation was the catalyst. He could not stand that she, this nobody, this functionary, had seen him. She had seen his weakness, the one thing his money could not fix, the one enemy his power could not intimidate. His face contorted, the gray pallor flooding with a deep, mottled red. His breathing became ragged, a desperate gulping for air that was no longer his to command. He was a king whose castle walls had been breached, and his only recourse was to order the execution of the messenger who brought the bad news, as if killing her could somehow unsay the truth she had spoken. He surged to his feet, the chair scraping violently against the polished marble floor, the sound like a scream in the tomb-like silence. He pointed a finger at Clara, a finger that now trembled, not with a subtle, pathological tremor, but with the violent, uncontrollable shaking of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not look at her. He couldn't. To look at her now would be to acknowledge the truth of what she had said. Instead, he turned his fury upon the manager, who was now scurrying towards the table, his face a mask of professional panic. Thorne's voice, when it came, was no longer a controlled hiss, but a ragged, guttural roar that ripped through the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant. "She's fired!" he bellowed, the words echoing off the high ceilings. "Get her out of my sight, now!" It was a desperate, pathetic reassertion of his power, the only power he had left in this situation. He couldn't make her undiagnose him, but he could make her disappear. He could use his money and his status to erase her from his world, to prove that he was still in control. The manager, a man named Jean-Pierre who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, could only nod, his professional composure shattered. He looked from Thorne's apoplectic face to Clara's unnervingly calm one, and he made the only calculation he could. He chose the money. He chose the power. He turned to Clara, his expression a mixture of fear and regret. "Miss Evans," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "please, collect your things." The words were an execution, a severance. Around them, the spell was broken. Diners began to murmur, some with shock, others with a kind of morbid excitement. They were witnessing a public execution, a raw display of power that was usually kept behind the closed doors of boardrooms. Clara, however, barely seemed to register the manager's words. Her mind was still processing, not the firing, but the connection. The name, Julian Thorne, Thorne Industries. It was a key, turning in a lock deep within her memory, a lock that had been rusted shut for over a decade. The humiliation of her dismissal was a distant echo, drowned out by the thunderous sound of her past colliding with her present. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the manager, her face a blank canvas. She turned and walked away from the table, her movements as fluid and composed as they had been when she was serving them. She did not look back at Julian Thorne, who had slumped back into his chair, his rage already giving way to a chilling, hollow-eyed fear. She moved through the restaurant, a ghost once more, but a different kind of ghost now. She was not invisible, she was unseen, a force that had passed through this place and fundamentally, irrevocably altered its landscape. In the staff locker room, the mundane reality of her life came back into focus, the smell of disinfectant and cheap soap, the small, dented locker containing her worn-out sneakers, and a faded photograph of her father, smiling, from a time before the sickness. As she slowly unbuttoned the starched white uniform, the weight of what had just happened began to settle upon her. Not the diagnosis, not the confrontation, but this simple, brutal fact of her unemployment. The paycheck that paid for her father's medication, for the specialized food, for the roof over their heads, was gone. The walk home through the cold city streets was a blur. The glittering lights of the skyscrapers seemed to mock her, monuments to a world of wealth and power from which she had just been violently ejected. The wind cut through her thin coat, a physical manifestation of the icy dread that was beginning to seep into her bones. Each step was heavy, each breath a struggle against the rising tide of panic. How would she tell him? Not her father, he wouldn't understand the details, but how would she face him knowing she had failed in her most fundamental duty, to provide for him, to protect him? The image of his frail body, so dependent on her, was a constant, aching presence in her mind. For a moment, the neurologist, the brilliant diagnostician, vanished, and all that was left was a daughter, terrified and alone, the sole pillar of a collapsing world. The weight of her responsibility, a weight she had carried for years with silent, stoic grace, suddenly felt unbearable, threatening to crush her completely. She pushed open the door to her small apartment. The familiar scent of antiseptic and her father's quiet, rhythmic breathing washing over her. The space was humble, almost monastic, every object within it chosen for its utility, not its beauty. Her father was asleep in his hospital bed, which dominated the small living room. A book lay open on his chest, his reading glasses slipped down his nose. He looked peaceful, a temporary reprieve from the prison of his own body. And in that moment, seeing him, the despair that had been threatening to drown her began to recede, replaced by a different, harder emotion. It was a slow-burning ember of rage, not the explosive, impotent fury of Julian Thorne, but something colder, denser, and far more dangerous. It was the rage of injustice, the fury of a life derailed, of a brilliant man laid low, of a future stolen. It was the anger she had suppressed for 10 long years, the anger she had channeled into study and service and silent endurance. The name echoed in her mind again, louder this time. Julian Thorne, Thorne Industries. It wasn't just a name from the news, it was a name from her nightmares. She moved to a closet in the hallway, her movements now filled with a new, urgent purpose. She pulled down a dusty cardboard box, the flaps sealed with yellowing tape. The box was labeled simply, "Dad, Legal." Her hands trembled slightly as she pried it open. Inside was a collection of files, a decade-old monument to a failed fight, lawyers, letters filled with incomprehensible jargon, medical reports detailing the toxins found in the town's water supply, and at the very bottom, a bound document, the settlement agreement. A pittance paid out by a corporate behemoth to silence a community of grieving, broken families. A legal maneuver designed to shield the guilty from any real accountability, a masterpiece of corporate malfeasance. She opened the settlement, her fingers tracing the dense lines of legal text that had sealed her family's fate. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. And then she found it, the final signature page, her mother's shaky, grief-stricken signature on behalf of her incapacitated husband. And below it, a bold, arrogant scrawl, a signature that was less a name and more a brand, an assertion of absolute authority. Julian Thorne, CEO, Thorne Industries. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. It was him. The man in the restaurant, the man whose secret illness she had exposed, was not just a random tyrant. He was the architect of her family's destruction. He was the faceless monster who had poisoned her father, who had destroyed her hometown, who had forced her to abandon her dreams. He had done all of that, and he didn't even remember. To him, her father, her entire town, was just a line item, a cost of doing business, a problem solved with a check. A new kind of resolve, as hard and as sharp as a diamond, solidified in her soul. The fear was gone. The despair was gone. The grief, for a moment, was held at bay. All that remained was a purpose so clear and so powerful, it felt like a physical force inside her. This was no longer about a lost job. This was no longer about a personal insult. This was about a decade of pain, a lifetime of stolen potential. This was about justice, not for her, but for her father, and for every other family whose lives had been shattered by that signature. She was not a victim anymore. She was the one person on earth who held two pieces of a puzzle that no one else knew existed. She knew about the crime, and she knew about the illness. She understood, with the sudden, blinding clarity of a lightning strike, that Julian Thorne's own poisoned biology was the key to exposing his poisoned legacy. She sat for a long time in the quiet of the apartment, the settlement agreement open on her lap, the weight of her father's silent breathing filling the space around her. Her mind, the brilliant analytical machine that had been forced into dormancy, roared back to life. She began to formulate a plan, not of revenge, but of methodical, systematic annihilation. Lawsuits had failed. The system had failed. She needed a different weapon. She needed to fight him not in a courtroom, where he could bury her in motions and appeals, but in the court of public opinion, and in the scientific arena where truth was absolute. She needed help. She needed someone who could navigate the worlds she had left behind, the worlds of academia and media. A name surfaced from her memory, a face from her past at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Alistair Finch, her former mentor, a man whose entire career was built on a foundation of unshakable medical ethics, a man who had been heartbroken when she dropped out of the program. She found her old laptop, the battery long dead. After plugging it in and waiting for it to groan to life, she began to search. It took her less than 5 minutes to find him. Dr. Finch was now the head of the bioethics department at Johns Hopkins, a renowned author, a respected voice on the national stage. The thought of calling him filled her with a profound sense of trepidation. It was a call across a chasm of 10 years, a call from a life she had been forced to abandon. What would he think of her, the waitress calling from a cramped apartment, a ghost from his past? Would he even remember the brilliant student she had once been? Or would he only hear the desperation of a woman who had just been fired? She took a deep breath, the image of her father's sleeping face strengthening her resolve. She had nothing left to lose, and an entire world of justice to gain. She found his direct office number on the university's website. Her finger hovered over the keypad of her phone, the numbers glowing in the dim light of the room. This was the first step, the first move in a game she had never intended to play, against an opponent who had no idea he was even on the board. She was no longer Clara Evans, the invisible waitress. She was a weapon that Julian Thorne had unwittingly armed and aimed directly at his own heart. She pressed the call button. The phone began to ring, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Each ring a countdown to a new beginning, a final, desperate gambit for a justice that had been denied for far too long. A voice answered on the other end, a familiar academic baritone that she hadn't heard in a decade. Alistair Finch speaking. She closed her eyes, took one final steadying breath, and began to tell him everything. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy as she recounted the story. She started with the restaurant, the spilled drop of water, the brutal grip on her arm. She clinically detailed the diagnosis, the fasciculations, the thenar atrophy, the specific mention of Kennedy's disease. Then she told him about the name, the dusty box of legal files, and the signature on the settlement that had connected a random act of cruelty in the present to a decade of suffering in her past. She laid out the facts with the same dispassionate precision she had used on Thorne, building her case piece by piece, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a presentation of irrefutable data. She was not just telling a story of personal grievance, she was outlining a crime, a cover-up, and a perfect, terrible nexus of corporate and biological justice. When she finished, the only sound was the faint hum of the phone line, a thread connecting her small, dark apartment to the halls of power and influence she had left behind so long ago. Dr. Finch's first words were not of shock or pity. They were of academic fury, the cold, righteous anger of a man who had dedicated his life to the principle that medicine should be a force for good. He did what? Finch's voice was low, tight with a controlled rage that was far more intimidating than Thorne's explosive tantrum. "Clara, the diagnosis, you are absolutely certain?" She confirmed it, explaining the specific constellation of symptoms that made the diagnosis almost textbook, if one knew where to look. She could hear him pacing in his office, the sound of his footsteps, a metronome marking the seconds, as his powerful mind processed the implications. He was horrified by the personal assault, but he was intellectually electrified by the connection she had made, the link between the corporate poison and the CEO's own genetic malady. He saw the terrible, poetic justice in it, but more than that, he saw an opportunity to right a profound wrong. He stopped pacing. His voice, when he spoke again, had shifted. The anger was still there, but it was now channeled, focused, and strategic. "Clara, this is bigger than a wrongful termination lawsuit. This is monumental. The legal system failed you once. We cannot rely on it again, not at first. Thorne will bury you in legal fees. He will drown you in paperwork. We need a different kind of leverage. We need to strike him where he is most vulnerable. His reputation, his legacy, his stock price." He was no longer just her former mentor. He had become her first ally, her first strategist in a war she had just declared. He understood the battlefield and the nature of the enemy. He knew that to fight a monster like Thorne, you couldn't use the rules he had written. You had to write new ones. "You have the science, Clara," Finch continued, his voice gaining momentum. "You have the first-hand testimony. What you need is a megaphone. You need someone who knows how to weaponize the truth. Someone who isn't afraid of corporate giants. Someone who eats men like Julian Thorne for breakfast." A new name was introduced into the equation, a name that carried with it a reputation for fearless, relentless, investigative journalism. His name is Marcus Vance. He's an old friend of mine from our undergraduate days. He made a name for himself exposing the pharmaceutical lobby's price-fixing schemes a few years back. He's a bulldog. If there is a trail of evidence connecting Thorne Industries' chemical waste to that disease cluster, he will find it. He will not be intimidated, and he will not be bought. The path forward was beginning to clear, a single narrow road through a seemingly impassable wilderness. Dr. Finch provided her with Marcus Vance's private number, a number not available to the public. He made her promise to call him immediately, to tell him the entire story exactly as she had told it to him. "Tell him Alistair Finch sent you," he said, his voice firm. "And Clara, I am so sorry for what his company did to your family, and I am so incredibly proud of the woman and the scientist you have become. You did not abandon your gift. You were merely waiting for the right moment to use it." His words were a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. It was a validation of her lost years, a reframing of her tragedy not as a defeat, but as a period of forging, of tempering the steel of her intellect and her resolve for the battle that was to come. She was not a dropout. She was a specialist who had spent 10 years in the most intensive field research imaginable. After hanging up with Dr. Finch, Clara felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The fog of grief and survival had lifted, replaced by the sharp, invigorating air of purpose. She looked at the name and number on her screen, Marcus Vance. This was the next step. She was no longer alone. She had a mentor in her corner and a potential powerful ally a phone call away. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, even dangerous. Julian Thorne was not a man who would go down without a fight. He would use every weapon in his vast arsenal, his wealth, his lawyers, his influence, to crush her. But he had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He had underestimated her. He had looked at a waitress and seen nothing of value, nothing to fear. He had no idea that he had just picked a fight with the one person in the world who knew his greatest weakness and who now had an unshakable reason to use it against him. She moved to her father's bedside, gently adjusting his blanket. She looked at his face, the lines of worry and pain etched there even in sleep. A promise formed in her heart, a silent vow. She would not rest until the man responsible for this was held accountable. She would not stop until the truth was brought into the light. Her fight was his fight. Her victory would be his victory. With that renewed sense of mission, she walked back to the kitchen table, her small apartment now feeling less like a refuge and more like a war room. She picked up her phone, her hand steady, her resolve absolute. She dialed the number for Marcus Vance, the investigative journalist. As the phone began to ring, she knew that this was more than just a call. It was the first shot fired in a war for justice, a war that had been a decade in the making, and one she was now, finally, equipped to win. The voice that answered was gruff, impatient, and skeptical. "Vance," it barked, with no pleasantries. It was the voice of a man who operated on coffee and deadlines, who had little time for nonsense. Clara didn't flinch. She took a breath and began to speak, her own voice calm and precise, cutting through his hardened exterior with the sheer, undeniable force of her story. She started with the name Alistair Finch had given her, a key to unlock the first door of his attention. She could hear the slight shift in his tone, a flicker of interest replacing the reflexive dismissal. Then she began to lay out the narrative, starting with the glittering, corrupt world of Aurelia and the public humiliation by a titan of industry. She could sense him on the other end, listening intently now, the journalist's instinct kicking in, smelling the scent of a story that was far more than it appeared on the surface. She detailed the diagnosis, repeating the medical terms with flawless recall. She explained not just what Kennedy's disease was, but why it was so significant, why it was the chink in Thorne's armor. She painted a vivid picture of his shock, his terror, and his subsequent rage. Vance remained silent, letting her speak, a sign that she had captured his full, undivided attention. He was a connoisseur of hubris, a collector of stories about powerful men laid low by their own arrogance, and this was shaping up to be a masterpiece. He recognized the pattern, the fatal flaw of the powerful, the inability to see the humanity, and therefore the potential threat, in those they deemed beneath them. Thorne had not just fired a waitress, he had created an enemy with a unique and devastating weapon. Then she delivered the final, connecting piece of the puzzle. She told him about her father, about the town poisoned by Thorne Industries, about the settlement that was an admission of guilt wrapped in the language of denial. She told him about the signature. This was the moment the story transformed. It elevated from a personal tale of a brilliant woman wronged into a sprawling epic of corporate crime, systemic injustice, and a potential explosive reckoning. The silence on the other end of the line was now electric. Vance was no longer just a listener. He was a hunter who had just caught the scent of the biggest game of his career. He saw the headline, the Pulitzer, the chance to hold a truly untouchable man to account for his sins. When Vance finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its initial gruffness. It was replaced by a low, intense hum of excitement and strategic thought. "Miss Evans," he said, and for the first time, she felt a sliver of hope that someone else saw the full picture. "I need to meet you, in person, as soon as possible. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't post anything on social media. As of this moment, you are a ghost. We need to gather everything you have. The settlement papers, your father's medical records, any notes you made from your time in the MD-PhD program, everything." He was already in motion, his mind assembling the pieces, formulating the first stages of an investigation that would shake the foundations of Thorne's empire. He gave her an address, a small, discreet coffee shop in a neighborhood far from her own, for the following morning. He gave her specific instructions on how to get there, advising her to pay with cash, to be aware of anyone following her. It sounded like something out of a spy movie, but Clara understood the necessity for caution. They were not just taking on a man, they were taking on a corporation with limitless resources to protect its secrets. Julian Thorne would not hesitate to use those resources to silence her if he ever suspected what she was planning. The game had officially begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The rules of engagement were being set, and for the first time she was not a pawn, but a key player with a checkmate strategy in mind. Clara agreed to everything, her mind absorbing the instructions with the same eidetic precision she applied to medical textbooks. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her days in the high-stakes world of advanced neurology research. It was the thrill of the chase, the intellectual challenge of solving an incredibly complex problem. For a decade, her brilliant mind had been focused solely on the slow, heartbreaking puzzle of her father's decline. Now, for the first time, she had a new puzzle to solve, the complete and total dismantling of Julian Thorne. It was a problem that required not just scientific knowledge, but courage, strategy, and a willingness to step out of the shadows and into the light. After ending the call, she stood in the center of her small living room, the quiet hum of the city outside a distant backdrop to the storm of activity in her mind. She looked at the dusty box of legal files, no longer a symbol of her family's defeat, but an arsenal waiting to be deployed. She looked at her sleeping father, no longer just a source of her motivation, but the living, breathing evidence of the crime she was about to expose. Her life had been defined by a quiet, desperate battle for survival. Now it would be defined by a loud, defiant war for justice. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but for the first time in 10 years, Clara Evans felt truly, completely alive, her purpose clear and her resolve unbreakable. The waitress was gone, and the warrior had taken her place. The coffee shop was a deliberate choice, a place of shadows and anonymity, nestled in a part of the city Julian Thorne would never deign to visit. It smelled of burnt coffee beans and damp wool coats, a world away from the curated perfection of Aurelia. Marcus Vance was exactly as his voice had suggested, a man who looked like he ran on caffeine and cynicism, his face a roadmap of past battles fought in print, his eyes sharp and perpetually scanning, missing nothing. He sat in a corner booth, a fortress of crumpled newspapers and a steaming mug built around him, when Clara slid into the seat opposite him, placing a heavy accordion file on the worn Formica tabletop. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply nodded at the file, a silent command to begin. Her hands, which had been so steady in the face of Thorne's rage, now trembled slightly as she opened it. The documents inside represented a decade of pain, of legal defeats and medical despair, and laying them bare for this stranger felt like a violation, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of a justice she was only just beginning to believe might be possible. Vance's approach was not gentle. He was a surgeon of information, and he began his work with a brutal efficiency, his fingers flipping through the pages with a practiced speed that belied his thoroughness. He scanned the settlement from Thorne Industries first, his lips tightening into a thin, hard line. He saw the legal architecture of the cover-up, the carefully worded clauses that admitted no fault, while paying just enough to make the problem disappear. He grunted, a sound of grim recognition. This was his territory, the familiar landscape of corporate malfeasance. He then turned to her father's medical records, a thick stack of reports filled with clinical observations and inconclusive tests. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he read the notes detailing the steady, relentless progression of the disease. He was connecting the sterile legal language of the settlement with the human cost detailed in the medical charts, and in his mind, the abstract crime was beginning to take on a face, a name, a family. He was seeing the full shape of the injustice, and the cynical journalist was being replaced by the relentless crusader. Clara watched him, her own anxiety slowly receding as she recognized a mind at work that was as focused and intense as her own, albeit in a different discipline. He wasn't just reading. He was absorbing, cross-referencing, building a map of the enemy's territory. He would pause, tapping a finger on a specific line in a toxicology report, then flip back to a clause in the settlement, a low hum of concentration emanating from him. He asked questions that were sharp and to the point, stripping away all emotion to get to the core data. What was the name of the factory? What was its primary output? Who were the other families? She answered each one with the precision of a witness testifying under oath, her eidetic memory serving up names, dates, and chemical compounds she hadn't consciously thought about in years. In the dim light of the coffee shop, a powerful alliance was being forged, a fusion of her scientific genius and his investigative ferocity. They were two different kinds of experts, speaking two different languages, but they were united by a common target and a shared unspoken understanding of the fight ahead. After nearly 2 hours of intense silence, broken only by his terse questions and her calm answers, Vance finally pushed the files back towards the center of the table. He leaned back, running a hand through his already disheveled hair, and looked at her properly for the first time. The skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hard, calculating gleam. He saw her now, not as a victim, but as the key, the living piece of evidence that could unlock the entire case. He understood the power of her story, the sheer, undeniable drama of the confrontation at Aurelia. It was the perfect hook, the human entry point into a story of complex corporate crime. He began to speak, his voice low and conspiratorial, laying out the first stages of their campaign. He explained that the old legal case was a dead end, a sealed tomb. They needed new evidence, something so powerful it would render the old settlement irrelevant, something that would force the authorities and the public to look again. Their new headquarters became Vance's apartment, a chaotic space that was more newsroom than home. The walls were covered in corkboards, layered with maps, photographs, and notes from a dozen old battles. It smelled of stale pizza and ink. For days that blurred into weeks, they worked. Clara felt as though she had been plunged back into the most intense period of her doctoral studies, but the stakes were infinitely higher. She sat at his cluttered dining table, surrounded by stacks of scientific journals and environmental impact statements he had managed to unearth through his network of sources. Her task was to find the needle in a haystack of data, a direct, scientifically irrefutable link between the specific chemical soup dumped by Thorne Industries and the unique pathology of Kennedy's disease. It was a monumental undertaking, a journey into the darkest corners of toxicology and molecular biology. The work was grueling and often disheartening. She would spend 12 hours tracing the metabolic pathway of a single industrial solvent, only to find that its known effects, while harmful, did not align with the specific androgen receptor disruption that was the hallmark of her father's illness. Doubt, a cold and unwelcome companion, would creep into the edges of her mind in the quiet hours of the early morning. She would look at the photograph of her father she kept propped against a stack of books, his smiling face, a painful reminder of the man he had been, and a wave of despair would wash over her. Was this a fool's errand? Was she chasing a phantom connection, a ghost born of her own grief and desire for a neat, satisfying narrative of justice? In these moments, her motivation would shift from the intellectual pursuit of truth to the raw, visceral need to honor him, to make his suffering mean something more than a random tragedy. Vance, for his part, was a relentless engine of progress. While Clara was immersed in the microscopic world of cellular biology, he was working the phones, calling in old favors, and digging into the corporate history of Thorne Industries. He was a master at navigating the labyrinth of public records, shell corporations, and forgotten regulatory filings. He unearthed internal memos from the time of the dumping, heavily redacted but still hinting at a corporate culture of calculated risk and willful blindness. He found shipping manifests that detailed the exact chemical compounds being transported to the factory near her hometown, a list of toxic agents that sent a chill down her spine. He was building the circumstantial case, constructing the outer walls of the fortress they would eventually lay siege to. He provided her with the raw materials, the names of the poisons, and she was the one who had to figure out how they worked their deadly magic. The breakthrough came not with a sudden, dramatic flourish, but with a quiet click of understanding in the dead of night. Clara was staring at a diagram of the androgen receptor on her laptop screen, its complex protein structure as familiar to her as her own reflection. She was cross-referencing it with the chemical structure of a particular plasticizer from Vance's shipping manifests, a compound known as TX4. On the surface there was no known link. But Clara wasn't looking at the surface. She was looking at the subtle, three-dimensional geometry of the molecules. She noticed a similarity in the shape of a specific binding site on the receptor and a phenolic ring on the Texas-4 molecule. It was a long shot, a hypothesis based on a structural similarity that most toxicologists would dismiss. But her intuition, honed by years of studying the intricate dance of proteins and ligands, told her she was onto something. She began to dig deeper, falling down a rabbit hole of obscure biochemical research. She pulled up studies on endocrine disruptors, papers from research groups in Europe and Japan that hadn't yet made their way into mainstream American textbooks. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind making connections at a speed that felt almost supernatural. She found a small, underfunded study from a German university that described how certain industrial plasticizers could act as competitive antagonists at the androgen receptor site, not blocking it completely, but subtly altering its function over time. The study didn't mention Texas-4 specifically, but the class of compounds was the same. It was the first piece of external validation, a flicker of light in the darkness. The theory was not just hers anymore. It had a foundation in the work of others. The ghost she was chasing was beginning to take on solid form. This was the scientific smoking gun, but it was theoretical. They needed to prove that Thorne Industries knew or should have known about this potential danger. This led them to the next phase of the investigation: finding an insider. Vance explained that every corrupt corporation has its disgruntled employees, its conscience-stricken executives, its retirees with scores to settle. Finding that person was an art form. He spent days building a list of former chemical engineers and environmental compliance officers who had worked at the factory during the years of the dumping. He cross-referenced their names with public records, looking for any sign of a falling out with the company, a wrongful termination suit, a sudden and unexplained move across the country. It was a painstaking process of elimination, a search for a single crack in the monolithic facade of corporate loyalty and fear. Their search led them to a man named Arthur Kendrick, a retired chemical engineer living a quiet life in rural Vermont. He had left Thorne Industries abruptly 15 years ago, citing, quote, personal reasons. Vance's gut told him this was their man. Getting him to talk, however, would be another matter. People who crossed Julian Thorne had a habit of finding their lives systematically dismantled. Vance made the first call, a gentle, probing conversation, mentioning a historical piece he was writing on the chemical industry in the region. Kendrick was polite but guarded, his answers short and non-committal. He was a man with a heavy secret, and he had spent a decade and a half building a wall around it. It was clear that Vance, the hard-nosed journalist, was not the person who could breach that wall. Clara knew it had to be her. She was the one who could speak to him not as a journalist seeking a story, but as a daughter seeking justice. She and Vance drove the 6 hours to Vermont, the silence in the car thick with the weight of their mission. Kendrick's home was a small, neat cabin, surrounded by pine trees, the air clean and crisp. When Kendrick opened the door, he was an older man, with kind, tired eyes that held a universe of old regrets. Clara didn't start with accusations or questions about Thorn Industries. She started by showing him a picture of her father, the one from before the illness, the strong, vibrant factory foreman. She told him her father's story, her voice quiet and steady, devoid of melodrama, a simple, heartbreaking recitation of facts. She described the symptoms, the slow erasure of the man she loved, linking it back to the town, the factory, the water. Kendrick listened, his face slowly losing its color. He invited them inside, his hands trembling as he poured them coffee. He had seen her father's face before, not in person, but in a file that had crossed his desk nearly 2 decades ago. Clara's story was not a revelation to him. It was a confirmation of a nightmare he had been living with in silence for years. He finally began to talk, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of guilt and confession. He told them about an internal study he had conducted, a study commissioned by Thorn himself, to assess the potential neurological and endocrine effects of the Texas 4 compound. His research had pointed to a terrifying conclusion that prolonged exposure could lead to the exact kind of androgen insensitivity that defined Kennedy's disease. He had presented his findings to the board, directly to Julian Thorn. He described the meeting with chilling clarity. Thorn had not been angry or concerned. He had been dismissive. He had looked at the report, with its dire warnings and statistical probabilities, and treated it as a financial problem, not a human one. The cost of safely disposing of the chemical waste was calculated against the potential cost of future litigation, discounted for the difficulty of proving causation. It was a cold, bloodless equation, and the lives of the people in Clara's hometown were on the wrong side of the ledger. Thorn had ordered the study buried, all copies destroyed, and had made Kendrick sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, reminding him that his career and reputation were in Thorn's hands. Kendrick had taken the deal, the guilt of his silence, a poison he had been swallowing every day since. But he had kept one thing. He had not been able to bring himself to destroy his personal copy of the research. It was his penance, his private proof of the crime. He led them to a locked safe in his study and pulled out a thick, bound report. On the cover were the words, "Project Nightingale, a toxicological assessment of Texas 4. Confidential. Thorn Industries." It was the Rosetta Stone of their case, the irrefutable proof of prior knowledge. The document that transformed corporate negligence into a deliberate, calculated act of criminal malfeasance. Holding it in her hands, Clara felt a tremor pass through her. It was heavier than paper and ink. It was the weight of a decade of lies, the physical manifestation of the truth she had been searching for. The science was no longer theoretical. The crime was no longer deniable. As they drove back from Vermont, the report secured in a briefcase on the seat between them, a new, more dangerous phase of their plan began to take shape. They now had the weapon, but they needed to choose the time and place to use it for maximum impact. A lawsuit was still too slow, too vulnerable to Thorn's legal machinations. Vance argued for a different kind of trial, a trial in the court of public opinion, one that would be swift, brutal, and televised. He looked at Clara, his eyes intense. "He humiliated you in his world, in that restaurant," Vance said, his voice low. "We have to destroy him in his world, on his stage, in front of everyone he commands and respects." He was talking about a public confrontation, an ambush from which Thorn would have no escape. Vance began his research, looking for the perfect venue. He found it almost immediately. Thorn Industries was holding its annual shareholder meeting in New York City in 3 weeks. It was the company's most important event of the year, a carefully choreographed piece of corporate theater where Julian Thorn would stand before his investors and the global financial media to proclaim his own genius and the company's indomitable strength. The entire event would be live-streamed, broadcast to millions of people around the world. It was Thorne's throne room, the heart of his power, the one place on Earth where he felt completely untouchable. It was the perfect place to set a trap, the perfect stage for a public execution. The final pieces of the plan began to fall into place with a terrifying momentum. Vance used to contact a disgruntled broker who owed him a favor to acquire a single proxy share in Thorne Industries, just enough to grant them legal entry to the meeting. He began working with a trusted video editor to cut together the evidence into a short, devastating presentation. Kendrick's confession, filmed on a hidden camera, excerpts from the secret report, and interviews with other families from Clara's hometown, their faces and voices a powerful chorus of grief and accusation. They were building a missile, and the shareholder meeting was the target. All they needed was someone to press the launch button. Clara knew, without a word being spoken, that it had to be her. She was the nexus of the entire story. She was the one who had been personally humiliated by Thorne, the one whose family had been destroyed by his company, and the one whose unique scientific mind had uncovered the truth. She was not just a witness. She was the living embodiment of his crimes, the ghost from his past, and the agent of his downfall, all in one. The thought of standing up in that room, of facing Thorne and his army of lawyers and executives, filled her with a profound and visceral fear. The invisible waitress was being asked to step onto the world's biggest stage and take down a giant. But as she looked at the evidence piled on the table, at the faces of the other victims in the video testimonials, her fear was eclipsed by a cold, hard certainty. She spent the final days not in fear, but in preparation. She memorized every line of the Nightingale report, every detail of the chemical pathways, every fact of the case. She rehearsed her statement, not to learn the words, but to strip them of all emotion, to deliver them with the same chilling, clinical precision she had used to diagnose Thorne in the restaurant. She was sharpening her voice into a weapon, a scalpel that would cut through decades of lies and expose the rotten core of Thorne's empire. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer a victim seeking revenge or a daughter seeking justice. She was a scientist, and she was about to present her findings. The data was conclusive, the experiment was designed, and the subject, Julian Thorne, had no idea that the final, catastrophic results were about to be published for the entire world to see. The stage for the checkmate was set. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was a cathedral of capitalism, a cavernous space designed to inspire awe and deference. The air, chilled to an almost unnatural degree, hummed with the low thrum of 1,000 quiet conversations, the collective murmur of immense wealth contemplating its own perpetuation. On a massive stage, bathed in the sterile white glare of spotlights, Julian Thorne stood at a sleek, minimalist lectern, a solitary figure of absolute power against a backdrop of cascading corporate logos. He was, in his element, his voice, a smooth, confident baritone that rolled over the assembled shareholders and media, speaking of growth projections and market dominance. He was a king addressing his court, every gesture practiced, every word calculated to project an aura of infallible genius. In the vast, tiered seating below, Clara Evans was an anomaly, a single, dissonant note in a symphony of expensive suits and calculated ambition. She felt the gazes of those around her, the brief, dismissive glances that registered her simple, dark dress, and saw not a shareholder, but a staff member, someone who had wandered into the wrong room. She let them look. Her invisibility, once a professional necessity, was now her greatest tactical advantage. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was a cold, still lake, the plan reflected perfectly on its surface. She was no longer a waitress, but a scientist about to present a paper, and the entire world was her peer review committee. The Q&A session began, a carefully managed piece of theater with pre-screened questions from major institutional investors. But Vance's plan had accounted for this. He had coached her on the precise moment to move, during the brief, chaotic transition between two vetted speakers. Clara stood, her movement so sudden and decisive that it commanded attention. She began to walk down the carpeted aisle toward the floor microphone, a lone figure moving against the tide of corporate conformity. Every step was an act of will, a battle against the screaming instinct to flee, to return to the shadows. She could feel Thorne's eyes on her, a flicker of annoyance in his expression at this unscheduled interruption. He did not recognize her yet. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a minor inconvenience to be swatted away. The silence in the room grew as she walked, a vacuum of curiosity and confusion. The cameras, initially focused on the stage, swiveled to follow her progress. She reached the microphone, its cool metal a grounding force beneath her trembling fingers. She took a single, deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of power and deceit. She was in the heart of the beast, and it was time to cut it out. She did not address the shareholders or the board. She looked directly at Julian Thorne, her gaze a physical force that traveled across the cavernous room and struck him with pinpoint accuracy. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice amplified by the sound system, clear and devoid of any tremor, a voice of pure, clinical authority that was utterly out of place in this environment. "Clara Evans. We met recently at Aurelia. You may not remember me, but you might remember the diagnosis I gave you." A wave of confusion rippled through the audience. Thorne's confident smile faltered, replaced by a mask of sudden, chilling recognition. The blood drained from his face as he stared at the woman at the microphone, the ghost from the restaurant, the specter of his own mortality now standing before his entire world. Clara continued, her tone unchanging. "I identified your condition as Kennedy's disease, a rare X-linked spinal and bulbar muscular atrophy. I mentioned it was often missed because its neurological symptoms are linked to a deeper endocrine dysfunction, a flaw in the body's ability to process androgens." Every medical term she uttered was a hammer blow against his composure, a public unveiling of the secret terror he harbored in the quiet of the night. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight, uncontrollable twitch that started at the corner of his eye. He was no longer a titan on a stage. He was a specimen under a global microscope. Then came the pivot, the move that transformed a moment of personal humiliation into an act of catastrophic corporate justice. "And while Mr. Thorne's personal health is his own affair," Clara stated, her voice ringing with a new, harder edge, "the health of the hundreds of people in my hometown, people poisoned by his company with the very chemicals that likely exacerbated his own genetic condition, is a matter of public record." As she spoke those words, the massive screens behind Thorne, which had been displaying rising stock charts, flickered and changed. The corporate logo dissolved, replaced by the face of Arthur Kendrick, the retired chemical engineer, his eyes filled with the weight of a confession he had held for 15 years. His voice, clear and damning, filled the ballroom, narrating the story of the buried Nightingale report. Then images of the report itself flashed on screen, its confidential stamp a blood-red accusation. Pages detailing the known toxic effects of the Texas 4 compound were highlighted, followed by a map of her hometown, with red dots indicating the disease cluster that perfectly matched the factory's toxic plume. Finally, the screen filled with the faces of the victims, their video testimonials a silent, heartbreaking chorus, culminating in a photograph of Clara's father in his prime, strong and smiling, a devastating contrast to the man he had become. The carefully constructed reality of the meeting had been shattered, replaced by an undeniable, televised truth. The ballroom erupted into chaos. It was the sound of an empire collapsing in real time. Shouts from journalists, horrified gasps from investors, the frantic clicking of 1,000 cameras. On the side screens, the Thorne Industry stock ticker, which had been a serene river of green, turned into a cascading waterfall of red, the numbers plummeting in a digital hemorrhage of billions of dollars. On stage, Julian Thorne was a statue of pure terror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The teleprompter was blank, his script was gone, His entire world was on fire. His carefully tailored suit suddenly seemed too large for him, his body shrinking under the weight of his exposure. Board members were scrambling, security was rushing the stage, not to protect him, but to remove him, to sever the corporation from its now toxic leader. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability of catastrophic proportions. As they led him away, his eyes found Clara's one last time. In them, she saw not hatred, but a hollow, vacant understanding. The king had been checkmated. His power, his wealth, his legacy, all erased in the space of 3 minutes by the waitress he had dismissed as nothing. Type Justice in the comments if you got chills when Clara Evans finally exposed the truth for the entire world to see. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and legal proceedings. The Department of Justice, armed with the Nightingale report and Kendrick's full testimony, unsealed a massive federal indictment against Thorne Industries and Julian Thorne personally, citing corporate fraud, criminal negligence, and a racketeering-level cover-up. The company he had built into a monument to his own ego was dismantled, sold off for parts, its name becoming a permanent stain in the annals of corporate crime. But for Clara, the victory was not in the headlines or the downfall of her enemy. It was in the quiet moments, in the calls she received from other families in her hometown, their voices thick with tears of gratitude, a community finally given a voice, a chance at true justice. She had not just won a battle for her father, she had won a war for them all. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a package arrived. It was not from a law firm, but from a company she knew well. Kestra Therapeutics, a pioneering biotech firm specializing in rare genetic disorders, the very company Thorne had once tried to acquire and crush. Inside was not a legal document, but a proposal. They had followed her story, seen her diagnostic brilliance, and her unshakable moral courage. They weren't offering her a job, they were offering her a new beginning. The letter detailed their offer to establish and fully fund a new research division, the Evans Center for Neurogenetic Medicine. They were offering her the directorship, a state-of-the-art laboratory, a hand-picked team, and a singular mission: to develop a treatment and ultimately a cure for Kennedy's disease. It was a staggering, life-altering opportunity, a path back to the dream she had been forced to abandon a decade ago, but on a scale she had never imagined possible. It was the ultimate poetic justice, the chance to use the very intellect that had exposed a poisoner to create the antidote. She sat with the letter in her hands, the thick, creamy paper, a stark contrast to the flimsy, faded legal documents that had defined her life for so long. She looked over at her father, who was watching a nature documentary, a small, peaceful smile on his face. The road ahead for him was still long, but for the first time it was a road illuminated by a genuine, powerful ray of hope. Her personal tragedy had been forged into a public triumph, her quest for justice transformed into a mission of healing. Clara now walks the brightly lit corridors of the Evans Center, not in a waitress's uniform, but in a crisp white lab coat that feels like a second skin. The air here smells not of truffles and old money, but of progress and possibility, the clean, sterile scent of a brighter future being built one experiment at a time. Her team, a collection of the brightest minds in the field, looks to her not just as a boss, but as an inspiration, a living testament to the idea that expertise, when fueled by love and courage, can move mountains and topple giants. On her desk, next to a complex molecular model of the androgen receptor, sits the faded photograph of her father, still smiling. It is no longer just a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what can be reclaimed, a promise she renews every single morning. She had walked into the darkness to confront a monster, and in doing so, she had not only found justice for her past, but had discovered a way to create a better future for countless others, proving that the most powerful force in the universe is not wealth or status, but a brilliant mind with an unbreakable will and an unwavering purpose. If Clara Evans' incredible journey from an underestimated waitress to a world-changing scientist inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that one person truly can make a difference. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment.